Hello, everybody. I'm Natalie Brunell. Thank you so much for checking out my show, where I get to hear from the leading voices in Bitcoin, financial markets, political structures, philosophy, and more. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show. And if you're watching this on YouTube, like this video so more people see it and hit that notifications button so you don't miss out on any new content. This podcast does not provide financial advice. It is for educational and entertainment purposes only. So make sure you always do your own research before making any financial decisions and be aware of your risk tolerance. I'm able to produce this show thanks to my sponsors, and I'm very picky about who I choose to partner with. So I hope you'll take the time to listen to the ad reads throughout the show. All right, now to my main partner, Swan Bitcoin. I'm proud to partner with Swan because it is a Bitcoin-only company focused on helping people save for their future and self-custody their Bitcoin, not trade it. Swan offers a private client service, retirement planning, tax loss harvesting, and even home equity conversion. Swan is also committed to educating millions of future Bitcoiners through free educational resources and media projects. I actually use Swan to dollar cost average every day. I deposit a little bit every day that's equivalent to what I might spend on a meal, because I actually read that dollar cost averaging daily ends up with a lower cost basis than weekly or bi-monthly at the end of a given year. Swan also produces my show, Hard Money, which reports on Bitcoin adoption and macro trends around the world. So make sure to subscribe to that as well. And to learn more and get $10 in free Bitcoin when you sign up, head to swanbitcoin.com/Natalie Brunell. All right, it's time for the show. Welcome back. I'm so excited to have with me again today Whitney Webb. Whitney's an investigative journalist. She published a 2-volume incredible book called Nation Under Blackmail about government corruption and really the ties between government and intelligence that led to the rise of Jeffrey Epstein. And Whitney, your work is so incredible. Thank you so much for joining me again, because you are my most popular guest, most viewed, most listened to.
Oh, well, great. Well, it's wonderful to be back. Thanks, Natalie.
So I want to start out actually by reading a quote. I'm going to kind of paraphrase a little bit or shorten it, because you put this right at the beginning, right before chapter 1. And I found it to be so emblematic of the theme of your entire book. So it says, and it's a quote, "Who are these people? They're the group that is popularly called the Enterprise. They are in and outside the CIA. They are CEOs. They are bankers. They are presidents. They own airlines. They own national television networks. They do not give a damn about the law or the Constitution or the Congress or the oversight committees, except as something to be subverted and manipulated and lied to. They deal in innuendo and character assassination and planted stories. They burn and shred files if caught. They commit perjury. And when caught, they have guaranteed sinecures with large U.S. corporations. If you let them, they will take over not only the CIA, but the entire government and the world, cutting off dissent, free speech, a free media, and they will cut a deal with anyone, from the mafia to Saddam Hussein, if it means more power and money. They are ripping off America at a rate never before seen in history. They ruin their detractors and they fear the truth. If they can, they will blackmail you. Sex, drugs, deals, whatever it takes." This is from a former CIA officer. And really, your book paints the picture of how this has been happening for decades. So why did you choose to start with that quote?
Well, like you said, I felt like it was a really good summary of the network I'm trying to outline. So what he referred to, so Bruce Hemmings, who said this, is a former CIA guy who turned whistleblower during the Iran-Contra hearings. So, he's referring, in talking about the enterprise, he's talking about Iran-Contra, the nexus within the national security state that, of course, extends beyond just the U.S. national security state, that was responsible for most of Iran-Contra, that's referred to in the Iran-Contra hearings and investigations and elsewhere, as, well, they sort of auto-referred to themselves as this as well, as the enterprise. So basically what I'm trying to show in the book is how the enterprise sort of came to be, and how blackmail is a really key part of that story, and how it's really the same nexus is very much tied up with the Epstein story as well. And that's why it's really no coincidence that you start having when you start looking into the Epstein intelligence connections and all of this, it takes you back to the 1980s and allegations of his involvement with major actors in the Iran-Contra scandal. So as I note a lot in the earlier part of the book, or volume 1, and as I've said in a lot of interviews, Jeffrey Epstein was not an anomaly, especially when it came to sexual blackmail, and that a lot of people that he was around, that are probably even better known names, or at least before 2019 were better known names than Jeffrey Epstein, like Adnan Khashoggi, or even institutions like the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. All of these were involved. There was a huge involvement in sex trafficking and sex blackmail. Some of it, in the case of BCCI, was remarkably similar to what Epstein would later do, and arguably even worse, because they targeted children even younger than Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell targeted. And this was a bank with major intelligence connections, and so if institutions themselves can do this and engage in this type of activity, we have a lot of questions we should be asking ourselves. And also, in light of what, recently happened with this, the firing of the Attorney General in the Virgin Islands right after she filed suit against JP Morgan in relation to that bank's connection with Epstein, and specifically Epstein's sex trafficking operation. How involved was JP Morgan? What did they know? And why was the Attorney General fired right after that? Looking at the banks, at the financial angle of this I've argued many times, is the thread that they don't want people to pull on at all, but it's very much interwoven in with this theme of sex blackmail and the subversion of our institutions, and it goes hand in hand with financial criminality, and you see this pattern happen over and over again. And what I'm trying to show in the book is that there's a particular network. They've evolved over time. They're not the same, they were in the 30s and 40s. A lot of the stuff they did in the past, they justified as necessary because of necessary to contain or stop the spread of communism. But then they end up working with those same adversary nations, the communist regimes, to further their own money and power. And Bruce Hemings, in that particular quote you were starting off with, noted that specifically, that they're willing to make deals with organized crime in the Soviet Union, make deals with the national security state of China, that are supposed to be our adversaries, and the national security state has committed all of these crimes supposedly because it was necessary to stop the expanse of those nations. But this same group is passing them sensitive military technology, engaged in arms trafficking, all other sorts of stuff to the benefit of those nations. And so it becomes abundantly clear that what this group cares about is expanding their own money and power, and they care about control. And this is ultimately, if at least one of, if not the most powerful faction that we have in the Western world right now running the show. Because if this is the entity that essentially controls the U.S. government. The U.S. government is an empire. It's U.S. empire, sort of the successor to the Anglo Empire, the British Empire. And some people argue that it's the Anglo-American Empire today, not necessarily wrong on that point. But that includes numerous states. That includes a lot of Europe. That includes a lot of Latin America, which has client states friendly to the U.S. installed on a regular basis throughout the 20th century. It's very extensive. The reach of this network, and it really can't be ignored at this point, especially when we're seeing all these major plays economically to install systems that are really more control systems and financial systems, particularly when it comes to the CBDC and other things. And I think it's instructive as a means of understanding how certain things going on right now are allowed to happen. For example, the whole FTX situation with Sam Bankman-Fried, a lot of the revelations that have come out of that, particularly his White House visits, an alleged connection to suspect DNC fundraising during the last election, just echoes so much a lot of what I talk about with Epstein in the mid 1990s. And it's just very staggering, especially when you consider that before Epstein became involved in those suspect fundraisers, he was developing massive Ponzi schemes, and then go straight from that into this world. And then you have Sam Bankman-Fried running a Ponzi scheme, and then doing the same type of stuff with White House visits. And there's a lot of overlap with stuff going on with he's using one of Ghislaine Maxwell's defense attorneys. There's this weird stuff about judges censoring who paid his bail, other people that may have had access to FTX accounts. Major influential parties are having their names censored
Mhm.
from the record with their involvement in FTX. There's obviously a bigger story there. But I just wanted to bring that up to point out that understanding how this stuff really works and how it is developed is really important to understand what's going on today, and the power plays we're seeing, and the
Mhm.
factions that are essentially fighting over the spoils of who gets to control the new serfs of
Mhm.
this neo-feudal system that's being erected.
Yeah, it was astounding how many parallels there were. And also just the fact that, a lot of this is going underreported. And I wanted to ask you because you talk about how in the past, powerful people were blackmailed. But today, with digital surveillance and all the data that they're collecting, they're also going to be blackmailing us, right? And you kind of loop to that at the end of the book. But I wanted to just ask you for a second because this is like, I mean, if you guys haven't had a chance, this is like 1,000 pages and everything is sourced. There are primary records, congressional reports, news outlets that you cite. How did you conduct this research and how did you decide to start in the 1940s with this OSS?
Okay, so the reason the book starts where it is because this was the book was always sort of intended to be an extension of a series I did back when I worked at Mint Press News that was 4 parts. And it was about the Epstein scandal, but about the context sort of before it, how sexual blackmail stuff had happened before, the allegations of that ties to intelligence, what have you. And so I wrote, 2 articles on that pre-Epstein context, and 3 and 4 were on aspects that were underreported of the Epstein situation. So that's why, it ended up being sort of structured like that, and why volume 1 is sort of like a massive expansion of the first 2 articles of that series, which is the pre-Epstein context, and then 3 and 4 also a massive expansion into what becomes volume 2, the Epstein focused aspect of the book. So, and going back and looking at my original series, some of it, could have been better. And, I'm not, this was a couple of years ago, and I really wanted to in this work make it stand the test of time, and I wanted to make sure my sourcing was really good because,
It's
in
incredible.
this line of work, you tend to get, attacked a lot for things. And so most of the attacks I get tend to be either ad hominem or allegations that have never been, there's no evidence for it. It's just they're saying, smear stuff. Very few people willing to argue with me about end notes or engage with the actual research and try and say it's false, but I wanted to, try and hedge any sort of
Yeah.
criticism, because I think the narrative here that I'm trying to show in my thesis, I think it's all very important and very pertinent. And really, ultimately, what I want people to do is engage with the information more. Of taking my word for it, I would really like it if people engaged more with the information. I actually did a video today, well, recorded it today, about someone who claimed that I didn't appropriately source my claims about J. Edgar Hoover, the former FBI director, and sex blackmail and all of that, and went over all of my sourcing and all of that. Definitely a much better attack on the book than I normally get, which is just ad hominem stuff, like I said. But it's I'm very confident in the sourcing of the material of this book. And
Well,
I just
can you shed any light on how you actually do this type of research and find these sources and records? Because that's what I found to be so impressive is, I mean, you have probably thousands of names in here and their companies who ran them. And the next person that they're linked to, it almost reads like an encyclopedia at some parts because it's just name after company, all tied together with these links that no one might expect unless you really dig into the papers, the paper trail.
Right. So, a good part of volume 1, I had a research assistant named Edmund Berger, who is amazing and a total genius. So he did some of some of the research for aspects of that book. So I can't speak to how he conducted his research, but it's brilliant. For me, it really depends on the part of the book. But a lot of stuff like Senate records and congressional records, all that stuff, are available online. Different things you can find different archived papers of different prominent people, companies they were connected to, organizations they were affiliated with, and get like directors lists and all of that stuff. And then there's also like newspaper databases, like newspapers.com. You can put in a name and search, and you'll get like 20 years worth of of newspapers, local newspapers in the US and elsewhere. There's all these different resources for finding these kinds of things. But some, like other more specific stuff, like in writing about, for example, Southern Air Transport's relocation for the benefit of Leslie Wexner's The Limited, and things like that. I had to go in the archives of the Columbus local newspaper. For some reason I'm blanking on its name right now, sorry, but that's not available in most newspaper archives. You have to go specifically in their archives, pay for access, and you have to sort of dig through all of those. At the time you have purchased your access to their archive, it was actually quite expensive, considering it's like a relative, the local paper for Columbus, Ohio. So it's kind of, sometimes it's specific to the topic, sometimes it's not. But I don't know if that really answers
Yeah. No,
answers your question or not.
Yeah, like I said, it's super impressive data distribution. Okay, so why did you decide to start in the 1940s with this OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was obviously an intelligence agency, and maybe we can get into a little bit of. I was fascinated by the fact that Roy Cohn, a name that is in the headlines, well, it was, at least recently when Trump was in office, the ties between intelligence, the president's office, J. Edgar Hoover, these parties held at the Plaza Hotel involving sexual blackmail. What can you share about sort of the beginning of the book?
Okay, so the reason it starts with the OSS is because I felt like it was a good point in talking about the merging of organized crime and intelligence. That a decent starting point would be something called Operation Underworld. And I think we talked about this in our last talk, so I'm not going to go too much in detail. But basically, it was during World War II, it was justified out of wartime necessity. The OSS and the ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, collaborated with organized crime figures in order to gather intelligence on New York docks. And of course, this cooperation between the nascent national security state and this particular faction of organized crime, which, circuit was around Mayor Lansky and Lucky Luciano, who together created what they referred to as the National Crime Syndicate. These particular interests deepened their cooperation. And so, throughout the 50s and 60s, for example, there's documented CIA operations, including like assassination operations, where most of the assassins were mob guys, or you see the people, OSS veterans like Paul Hellawell and Castle Bank sort of merging with different actors in corporate and political power, and how that sort of develops, and how the offshore banking system develops, and how that involves a lot of these OSS veterans or active CIA people. And, the OSS is the precursor to the CIA. And you see how that sort of develops in the Caribbean, creating like this offshore banking system that intimately involves organized crime, which of course for a long time had been very active in the Caribbean because of casino interests or other interests. To their different rackets and businesses, because essentially a lot of people think of organized crime in terms of how Hollywood has conditioned them to think about organized crime. Ultimately, organized crime is a business, but it's a business that operates essentially outside the law, and intelligence agencies also tend to operate outside the law and are, as it's very clear in the United States, not accountable to the law like regular people are, and it can essentially do as they please. And so it's not really that much of a coincidence that you see these two worlds merge, even less so when you consider, as I note in the book, that the origins of the OSS and the CIA, a lot of the top people from the earliest time were very much connected with American oligarchy, very powerful families, the Morgans, the Mellons, the Rockefellers, and so on. You see them very much involved with the creation of this intelligence apparatus from the beginning. Even the Rockefellers themselves have their own private intelligence apparatus during the war and stuff. So the world of intelligence in the United States has never, it has always been connected with oligarch interests of some capacity. So you're seeing, their business interests get intertwined with organized crime interests and all of that. And it basically becomes a way for both, organized crime to expand their power and wealth, intelligence agencies to expand their power, and of course for some of their members wealth as well, and then the oligarchs expanding their wealth and power. I mean, that's essentially what it's all about. at the end of the day. So I guess enough about that, and I'll go to the Hoover situation. So the allegation is that J. Edgar Hoover, well, we know what we do 100% definitely know. J. Edgar Hoover had a very suspect relationship with two organized crime connected individuals, Louis Rosenstein
Mhm.
and Roy Cohn. So during the early 1950s, or much of the 1950s, Roy Cohn was legal counsel to Joseph McCarthy as part of the McCarthy hearings. Louis Rosenstein is like a liquor baron. He's the head of Schenley Industries, which is created after Prohibition ends
Mhm.
in the U.S., and he rises sort of to the top of the North American liquor market. He has a longstanding relationship with the Bronfmans, who become basically the liquor barons of Canada. But it's a very complex and later acrimonious relationship between Bronfman and Rosenstein. But they share a lot of the same organized crime connections, which of course were forged during the bootlegging period of
Mhm.
Prohibition, which
Yep.
set up these guys ready to go as soon as Prohibition ended, right? So Louis Rosenstein was well known at his workplace to be bisexual. He was referred to jokingly by employees as Rosie. And so it would make sense, too, that if it's so commonly known around the workplace, it likely was as well as in his social circles. Possibly less known is that Louis Rosenstein bugged his factory to compromise workers, catching snippets of conversations and using it against him. They're, of course, being recorded without their knowledge, and also doing the same for parties he hosted at his home. He has a very odd relationship with Roy Cohn, described as a father figure to Roy Cohn. As I talk about in chapter 4 of the book, Roy Cohn's upbringing is very complicated, sort of a lack of a father figure there and a very overbearing mother. But you have Roy Cohn being affiliated from a very early age with organized crime affiliates and organized crime interests through his own family and through his best friends throughout his childhood and their families. And later ascends rather rapidly through the Justice Department ranks, becoming, being a U.S. Working for the Justice Department pretty much straight out of law school, and then becoming chief counsel to McCarthy, beating out Robert F. Kennedy for that position. And of course, Hoover and Cohn both hated the crud out of Bobby Kennedy, among other things that I do sort of go into in the book. But Hoover enters the picture in a way that doesn't make a lot of sense. For example, Nicholas von Hoffman, who's probably one of Roy Cohn's best known biographers, was writing in the mid, I think in 87 or so, his book Citizen Cohn. And he doesn't, to him, Roy's account of how he officially met Hoover for the first time makes no sense. And the only way it can make sense is if they had met previously. And that's where this whole Plaza Hotel thing comes in. So basically, this allegation was first reported by Anthony Summers, who's an Irish journalist formerly with the BBC. He wrote a book called Official and Confidential in the early 90s. And in that book, he cites Louis Rosenstein's fourth wife,
Susan
Susan
Kaufman.
Kaufman. Yeah, and Susan Kaufman talks a lot about this, how she was taken to basically sex blackmail parties at the Plaza Hotel by her husband, Louis Rosenstein. Hoover was there and Roy Cohn was there. And
The New York
goes to
Cardinal was there. I mean,
yeah,
Catholic
Cardinal
Cardinal.
Spellman, whose secret sex life is now very well known. But talking about that at the time, I mean, you were just laughed at because they had very powerful positions. But now you
Mhm.
have like even mainstream media acknowledging that Cardinal Spellman was engaged in that type of activity. It's of course known with Roy Cohn as well. In the period it wasn't, but once he died from AIDS, it was obviously an open secret that he was, engaged in that type of those type of activities in his intimate life. And then Hoover, you have later on, after Anthony Summers come out, you have, it essentially becomes an admitted secret or open secret out in Washington. You have Bill Clinton at some point making a joke about it's going to be hard to fill J. Edgar Hoover's pumps like high heels, a reference to the claim that J. Edgar Hoover occasionally cross-dressed and stuff. And, you know, some people don't really like these claims, I guess, because they have this idea of who Hoover was supposed to be. But you know, it's very complicated. So anyway, it's Susan Kaufman is not the only source of that. There was also a New York attorney named John Klotz that used declassified New York government files, and also a private investigator to uncover, completely unrelated to Susan Kaufman, additional corroboration of there being this so-called blue suite in the Plaza Hotel that was being used for blackmail, basically a pedophile protection racket, as described by this New York attorney, and that it was involving, you know, these prominent individuals. So you have those allegations, and then the third corroborating source is former head of the Vice Squad at NYPD, James Rothstein. He claims that he and his partner had a sit down interview with Roy Cohn in the 1980s, that Roy Cohn admitted he was involved in sexual blackmail, running little boys, underage boys, for the purpose of these activities, and basically to entrap powerful people to ensure they would go along with the plan, whatever that means. And James Rothstein made this claim first in the early 90s to John DeCamp. He made it subsequently to another guy in the earlier 2000s, and I interviewed him myself in 2020. He made the same claims, and so, you know, that's three different sources corroborating that there was some sort of sexual blackmail activity going on there in the Plaza Hotel. In addition to that, you have Hoover being, according to the New York Post, involved with the ringleader of another extortion ring around the same time. Well, it was busted about a decade later, after this Susan Kaufman attended these Plaza Hotel soirees, or whatever you want to call them, and it was called the Chicken and Bowls extortion ring. You can find remnants of it in the New York Times archive. Even slate.com at one point published a long form piece about this particular extortion ring. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the New York Post reported that the ringleader of the ring, a guy named Sherman Kaminsky, was in photos with Hoover. The FBI becomes involved in the investigation of this ring after it's busted, and Hoover's pictures, of course, disappear from the file. And, you know, that's that. And somehow Sherman Kaminsky is able to escape from the New York courthouse during his sentencing hearing, and he isn't found for 11 years. So I would like someone to explain to me how you're able to escape your sentencing hearing from a busy courthouse in Manhattan,
Wow.
you know, and then not be found. It's pretty impressive. So, you know, that's J. Edgar Hoover tied up with two sexual blackmail operations, allegedly with different sources. You know, there's a decent amount of evidence there. And then to add the cherry on top, you have the FBI and Hoover and Cohn being involved in some way with the Profumo affair, which brought down the conservative government of Harold Macmillan in Britain in I guess the early 60s. And there was an attempt to blackmail John F. Kennedy as part of that. One of the girls that was used as part of this blackmail ring, named Mariella Novotny, was brought to the United States, and she was arrested, as was her apparent handler, a British guy named Harry Allen Tower. And she left her client list with the FBI, and for mysterious reasons, the FBI destroyed it and didn't pursue charges against her. So when you look at the same nexus responsible for the Profumo affair as I do in the book, you find people like Thomas Corbally, a private detective tied to organized crime, also U.S. intelligence, and he's involved in Britain with these weird sex blackmail parties. Corbally later get involved with Heidi Fleiss, the Hollywood madam, after all of this with the Profumo affair plays out. But it's, you know, there's a lot of patterns here, and it's very hard when you put all of this together to say, oh, this is just coincidence, which is what a lot of people like to do, and say that there's no evidence of conspiracy or anything there. This is all just a coincidence. But when you put it the way I try and put it in the book, it makes it very difficult to argue that it's a coincidence, especially with what we know about J. Edgar Hoover and his use of blackmail, that he had these files on people in his office, friend and foe alike, and would weaponize that as he saw fit. And he wasn't the only one that did this. This was also commonly used by people at the top of the CIA, like James Jesus Angleton. And you have a lot of power struggles between the CIA and the FBI, and they're like, you know, warring with each other over who gets to control what and who's more powerful in the national security state and all of that stuff. It's again fighting over money and power. at the end of the day. But you have all this factional infighting. And, I mean, unfortunately, we've been sort of spoon-fed this narrative about American history that it's been a certain way, but in
Mhm.
reality, it's just been totally nuts, with a bunch of really awful people on both sides, duking it out for who gets to be on, top dog essentially.
Well,
And, the American people and of course people elsewhere who are the victims of pointless imperial wars, are the people who suffer for it.
yeah, I didn't realize that so many of our former presidents have, former jobs in intelligence agencies, and then names do keep coming up. Like Roy Cohn comes up when you talk about the Reagan era, and then he had
Oh
a
yeah,
relationship with Trump. He was the mentor to Trump,
it's
right?
Trump's mentor. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about some of these because I know there's so much to cover, and I want to be respectful of your time. But I wanted to ask you about the 1929 crash very quickly, only because you touch on it briefly. It was obviously before when OSS started, but are there any parallels? Because we've seen decades of, bubbles popping up, and then at the end of the day, they make the rich richer, the poor poorer. Is there anything that we can draw from what you learned about the 1929 crash and the people involved in the elite circle then that we can compare to today?
Okay, so the 1929 crash, I didn't really talk about so much in the book. I think the only place where I talk about it is when I'm talking about the collapse of a banking
Mm.
institution that was called the Bank of the United States. And
Yes.
this was being run by Roy Cohn's the maternal side of his family, the Marcus family, and specifically his uncle Bernie, Bernard Marcus, was in charge of the bank at the time it failed. And basically what he was doing was trying to bide time, but the bank was insolvent. There was obviously a lot of fraud. And they had specifically, that particular bank had been controversial from the time it had been created, a couple decades before the crash, because they called it the Bank of the United States, trying to make it sound like it was like a federally linked institution, when in fact it was not. And it advertised exclusively in immigrant communities, specifically immigrant Jewish communities. And that was most of the people that put money into the bank. And then the Marcus family, who were Jewish themselves, basically stole from their kin. And well, at least, we don't really know if Bernard Marcus took over from his father, who would be Roy Cohn's grandfather. And it's not obviously Bernard Marcus engaged in major fraud, which was caught at the time that the bank imploded, because they were going to merge with another bank, and then the bank they were going to merge with looked at the books and like freaked out, and then they tried to stall, for all this time, and then it all came tumbling down. And what's interesting though is that the Marcus family, claimed it was anti-Semitism, which is why the bank was allowed to fail. But actually it had been rescued previously. Like, people tried to raise alarms in the 26 or something that the bank was insolvent and engaged in a lot of suspect activity. And the judge basically dismissed the case. And as I note in the book, the judge had some connections to a lot of these same networks that Roy Cohn's family was affiliated with. And nothing was done, and then all this fraud basically exploded afterwards. People lost loads of money, and it was one of the worst bank runs in American history.
Right.
But
I mean, it's crazy.
anti-Semitism
There are so
was
many
not the
parallels.
reason.
It's time for a quick break to hear these messages from my partners. First up, iTrustCapital. iTrustCapital lets you invest in Bitcoin for your retirement with the tax benefits of an IRA. You can defer taxes on gains using a crypto IRA, or with a Roth IRA, you can withdraw tax-free at retirement. And here are some important things to know given the recent crypto contagion. iTrust does not lend against client assets. iTrust accounts are also FDIC insured up to $250,000 US, and iTrust does not hold customer assets or money. Assets are actually held between Coinbase custody and a custody platform called Fireblocks. And Fireblocks, by the way, underlies pretty much the entire industry. Their multi-party computation technology is the gold standard of custody for institutions and allows for private keys to be separated, encrypted, and shared across multiple parties in cold storage. Separately, all US dollars are held within iTrust's bank, Signature Bank in New York. So if you're doing retirement planning and considering adding Bitcoin to your IRA portfolio, you can sign up for an account and get a $100 bonus at itrust.capital/Natalie Brunell. All right, next up, Bitcoin Conference 2023. This is the ultimate Bitcoin event every year, and it's going to be held once again in Miami Beach, May 18th through the 20th. Last year, there were about 30,000 attendees, and it's hard to believe the scale until you see it in person. There are incredible speaking sessions featuring the world's biggest Bitcoin voices, networking events, games, parties, and of course, Soundfest. I actually credit my career transition to the Bitcoin conference because I went for the first time in 2021. And that's where I dropped my first episodes of Coin Stories, not expecting this to become my full-time job at all, but just hoping to meet Bitcoiners and find more guests for the show. I actually went up to people like Michael Saylor backstage with a business card, and that's how I got him to come on the show. So anything can happen there, especially if you dream of working in the industry. Ticket prices go up every month until May, so don't miss out. And for 10% off, use the code HODL at b.tc/conference. I'll see you there. There are so many parallels.
Yeah.
Well, talking about banks, one of the ones that you focus on a lot in both volumes is the BCCI, that it was so extremely powerful, penetrated the US financial system. It helped facilitate so many scandals and was involved in arms dealing and trafficking and drugs and all of it. So can you share what you want people to know and maybe what you hope to spark curiosity so that they look into it more in the book as well?
Right. So BCCI, I mostly talk about in volume 1. I think it's like chapter 7, maybe a little bit of 8, where I focus on BCCI. But basically BCCI was nominally first a development bank. That's how it was, portrayed. But really, in my opinion, it operated more as a private intelligence apparatus. And as I note in the book, it's been alleged in numerous sources that there was intelligence agencies were responsible for the creation of the bank. So it's been, alleged for a long time that it was Pakistani intelligence, but there's a lot of indications that the CIA was also involved. Specifically Richard Helms, who's a former CIA director. And BCCI was involved in a lot of very crazy things. I mean, you can go online on archive.org, the Senate report that was, I think, written by John Kerry and another senator whose last name is Brown, wrote this report together. And, the stuff that's officially admitted by the US government about what BCCI did is totally insane. One of the most insane things, I mentioned earlier is about its involvement in sex trafficking, basically a template for what Jeffrey Epstein would later do with Ghislaine Maxwell. The founder of the bank, his last name's Abedi. I think it's Aga Hassan Abedi or something is his full name. He basically was pimping out underage kids from Pakistani villages to the elite of the United Arab Emirates and also unspecified VIPs of BCCI, whatever that means. And so basically the elite of the United Arab Emirates were being given a bunch of underage Pakistani kids that were taken by this female associate of Abedi, who would take them to the biggest cities in Pakistan, have them outfitted in fancy clothes, train them in sex technique. I mean, it's exactly like Ghislaine Maxwell. And then these girls would be sent over there. Some of them were prepubescent. Many of them would return with physical scars because of their interaction with these elites in the UAE. I mean, it's really sick stuff. And what kind of bank does this? This is supposed to be a bank. So again,
this collapse, it had a meltdown, not dissimilar to some of the things we're seeing now.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about BCCI's collapse is that it happens in 1991, which is when a lot of major developments happen. You have the collapse of the Soviet Union, for example. You have the cover-up of the PROMIS software scandal, and also Iran-Contra happened that year. And then, of course, you have basically a cover-up of the BCCI situation. And the last, all those cover-ups were handled by the Attorney General at the time, who was William Barr.
Right.
When he was Attorney General the first time, of course, he was Attorney General under Trump more recently, but he has a very long affiliation with the CIA, going back to the 70s, was involved in stonewalling the Church Committee, trying to investigate the CIA. He would, and then later allegedly represented himself as General Counsel of Southern Air Transport under an alias during Iran-Contra and all other sorts of crazy stuff.
And his dad hired Epstein, right? At the
yes.
Dalton.
Yes, and that was at a time when William Barr was already working for the CIA. So Donald Barr is an intelligence veteran, OSS
Mhm.
veteran. His son's working at the CIA when he hires Epstein. Yeah.
It's
When
fascinating, like name connected to a name, connected to a name.
Well,
And
it's really
again,
weird because Epstein was not qualified to teach even public school in New York City.
right.
So how did he get a job at the most elite, allegedly the most elite, one of the most elite, educational institutions
Okay,
there?
I want to touch more on Epstein and get back to also William Barr because we see so much of him even today. But can you share the backstory? Because now we're in the 90s, the backstory to Bill Clinton. I found your story so fascinating, learning about Uncle Raymond, his own ties to intelligence, and then Hillary Clinton and her law firm. I mean, you guys will read all of this in the book, but maybe a summary of the backstory of the Clintons and how they rose to power from Arkansas. Maybe people wouldn't expect that.
Yeah, so Bill Clinton's rise is very interesting. His uncle Raymond, as you just mentioned, had apparent organized crime connections, but also, political connections within Arkansas that allowed him sort of to get a leg up. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He studies at Oxford. Rhodes Scholars, the Rhodes Scholarship and Oxford in general have a lot of intersections with intelligence. And of course, when Bill Clinton later becomes president, his administration is stuffed with other Rhodes Scholars, just like him. But he's allegedly recruited by the CIA to spy on people while he's at Oxford in relation to, I think, the anti-war movement or something along those lines. So there's a lot of, of these interest apparent very early on in the Bill Clinton story. Then, of course, with Hillary Clinton, you have her being involved in the Rhodes Law Firm, which is a long-standing law firm in Little Rock, Arkansas. But during the period where she got involved, became very much involved with the fortunes of a man named Jackson Stevens, who is a very, very powerful businessman who I guess most of his business interests are based in Arkansas, but he is much involved in a lot of stuff much bigger than Arkansas, and ended up not just bankrolling a lot of the Clintons' political careers, but also Bush Sr., for example, and he had a lot of involvement with a lot of this intelligence related stuff I talk about in the book through his different companies, and a lot of his ability to use his companies for those purposes were directly facilitated by the Rose Law Firm, where you have Hillary Clinton. And in addition to her, you have other people that have prominent roles in the early Clinton administration, Webster Hubbell and Vince Foster. Webster Hubbell is has to leave, of course, under a cloud of scandal, and Vince Foster dies relatively early on in the Clinton administration under very, as I note in the book, suspect circumstances. And it's not the only suspect death of a top Clinton official during the Clinton presidency. So
Yeah,
I don't.
can you share a little bit more about Fostergate, because it was sort of illustrative of what we're seeing and hearing since then. This idea of there was a fundraiser, and one of the most surprising things I read was that Hillary Clinton allegedly was selling high-level nuclear code secrets to Israelis, and then there was a payoff. Vince
Yeah.
Foster's wife got like a $286,000 deposit mysteriously in her account, and he was going to meet with the president, and suddenly he's dead.
He rejected hush money apparently, and then was gonna drop this whole mess in Bill Clinton's lap, but died beforehand. Well, that's the allegation. So this is a very complex story. So people that want the details on it, I would refer
Yeah.
you to the book because it's all out there. So basically you have Jeffrey Epstein from 1987, possibly 1985, with some of this stuff. He's in Leslie Wexner's inner circle by the time he's affiliated with the Clintons at the beginning of their administration. He's Leslie Wexner's money manager and has almost total control over Leslie Wexner's business entities and finances through a very far-reaching power of attorney. And but he also created a Ponzi scheme around that same time with Stephen Hoffenberg that collapses spectacularly in 1993.
Towers
Towers
Financial.
Financial, one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history. His name is dropped from the case, and he begins. He's associated at that same time with this fundraiser at the Clinton White House that's not necessarily being run by the DNC or Bill Clinton. It's being run by the White House Historical Association and the First Lady's office, meaning Hillary Clinton. And
To redecorate, right?
allegedly to redecorate. So I might actually just refer to my book for part of this, if you don't mind, because I think
Yeah.
it gives a better idea of what we're dealing with here. Might take me a second to find it, sorry.
Sure, no worries.
So
I found it to be fascinating. I was
Yeah, I mean, it's
foster.
a really crazy story. So the New York Times reported on Vince Foster's quote unquote suicide note. So
Right.
first off, police, when they searched Foster's office after his death and his body was discovered, found nothing in his briefcase. His briefcase is empty. Then somehow 36 hours later, the First Lady's office says that this suicide note appeared, and it's Foster's. It's sometimes also referred to as Foster's quote unquote resignation letter. And what's odd about it is the New York Times wrote the following about it, and that's the quote I'm looking for. Yeah. So um so she's responsible. So basically Hillary Clinton is the main person behind the 30-hour delay in releasing Foster's alleged suicide note to authorities, and photographing the note was forbidden. It was exempt from Freedom of Information Act requests. A copy was somehow obtained by a man named James Davidson, who arranged for 3 handwriting experts to examine the note. They judged it to be a forgery. Anyway, but Hillary Clinton's personal involvement is important because the note states that, quote, the usher's office plotted to have excessive costs incurred taking advantage of Khaki Hockersmith and HRC Hillary Rodham Clinton. So according to the New York Times, interpreting that line of the letter, it says Hillary Rodham, that the notes, this part of the note refers to, quote, Hillary Rodham Clinton's redecoration plans for the White House, and cryptically charged that the usher's office, which oversees the renovations, was using those plans against Clinton and her decorator, Khaki Hockersmith. And then it goes on to say, quote, Mr. Foster alluded to cost overruns in schemes associated with the redecorating, which he did not describe, but feared would embarrass the president and Mrs. Clinton. So this is the fundraiser that Ponzi schemer Jeffrey Epstein, name drop from the case, is affiliated with redecorating this. It ends up in Vince Foster's suicide note. It's the only mention of Hillary Clinton in the whole suicide note. And the New York Times says it was because of schemes associated with this. And it would have been Vince Foster's job as chief counsel to determine if there was anything suspect about the finances of that fundraiser.
So what
And
would they be
then,
raising funds for? And what was this tied to the potentially nuclear codes to the Israelis?
right. So that's a part of something else that's, well, it's related, right? So it's not necessarily tied to the fundraiser. In the same mix where you have Foster's death, you have this Fostergate story. So the top investigative reporter at Forbes in 1995 was a man named James Norman. James Norman wrote this very explosive piece that he called Fostergate. And basically the allegations of Fostergate, based on, he had a lot of different evidence backing his claims, and basically was able to confirm a lot of it, corroborate a lot of it, but he did use some anonymous intelligence sources. But again, it's a very sensitive story. So basically, the allegation is that Vince Foster had a Swiss bank account. Hillary Clinton shared that bank account with him to some extent, and that basically Hillary Clinton was selling nuclear codes and other sensitive information, most of which obtained from the NSA, to Israel, and that Israel was then sending money to the Swiss bank account of Vince Foster, and that he and Hillary Clinton were essentially partaking in that. And allegedly, the Israelis would then sell that information on to other countries like China, our ostensible adversaries. Right. So, there's a lot more detail than that in the book of why this is a probable incident, and it's very alarming. Because basically you have a grave undermining of national security happening there. But it is consistent with some other things I do talk about in the book. For example, Israeli espionage targeting the US in the 1980s through either Jonathan Pollard or the PROMIS software scandal is very significant, involves Robert Maxwell, for example, and was very focused on US nuclear institutions. Then you have this fundraiser where you have Epstein and Robert Maxwell's daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, tied up with, Hillary Clinton and Vince Foster. They're involved with this weird fundraiser that's obviously quite suspect. And then Vince Foster dies, and it's, according to James Norman, apparently connected to, Israel and nuclear, theft of sensitive nuclear secrets
Well,
basically.
this is a great place to talk about. You call it PROMIS. I was reading it PROMIS, but one of the most fascinating parts of your book. This is software. It was created by a former NSA official and his wife. And then you write that it ended up in the hands of Israeli intelligence, where there was a trap door installed. And then that version was marketed to governments, corporations, high security laboratories, and it could essentially track anything, but it was particularly good at tracking money and people. And so there was a
Yeah.
bugged version of the software. Israel had a version and the US had a version. Can you sort of spell that out? Because as you mentioned, Robert Maxwell ended up marketing this software, and it allowed it was like a double mirror. Once you had it installed,
Yeah.
Israeli intelligence could essentially see everything that was happening.
In real time. Yeah. The PROMIS software was basically a major global coup. And it was a global coup in two senses. So like you said, the PROMIS software was really good at doing two things: tracking people and tracking money. The tracking people side, I would argue, is really the focus of the Israeli version, and the tracking of money was more of the focus of the CIA, with the collaboration of Systematics, a Jackson Stevens company, tied up with Vince Foster. And going back to Vince Foster, the way he was able to obtain those NSA documents was because of his role at Systematics, the Jackson Stevens company. Systematics was a contractor for the NSA. So, but essentially the PROMIS software scandal, there's these two sides of it: the US version created with the CIA, and the Israeli version. The Israeli version infinitely more successful in terms of sales than the CIA version. And the main salesman for the Israeli version was Robert Maxwell, who was already at the time an asset of Israeli intelligence, but became much more actively involved after he was directly recruited by a man named Rafi Eitan, a well-known Israeli spy master, also the handler for Jonathan Pollard, and a huge amount of espionage targeting the United States. And in doing so, Robert Maxwell sold PROMIS mostly to security agencies around the world. And it was, throughout in Latin America, in the United States, in Eastern Europe, and beyond. It's focusing mainly on security agencies. In the case of the US, though, it was mainly sold to nuclear laboratories, or, federal laboratories like Sandia Labs and Los Alamos. And the only way he was able to succeed in selling that software, because people at those labs tried to contact the NSA and raise the alarm that something was seriously wrong here, and they were shut down, and the FBI investigation shut down. And the FBI today still will not release their documents about Robert Maxwell and PROMIS. That's insane. It's been a really long time. You think they could release it if there's nothing there, but there obviously is. And one of the reasons, anyway, that he was allowed to access that is because Henry Kissinger told him exactly who to pay off and recruit for Israeli intelligence. So Henry Kissinger is a dirty, rotten traitor to the United States of America, and let us hope that 2023 is the year he finally dies, because it's intolerable being on the same planet as him. Anyway, sorry about that.
Yeah, no, Bitcoiners often talk about him. He engineered the petrodollar. So
yeah, he engineered a lot of things.
Yeah.
He's a pretty awful human being, and may he go soon. But anyway, Kissinger told him to pay off a guy named John Towers, who was the head of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He was a senator from Texas, and he was due to leave office. And and Maxwell, at the recommendation of Kissinger, puts Towers on the Mossad payroll and uses him to open the doors to Los Alamos. Of course.
I was so shocked that I had never heard about this PROMIS scandal before. And I just want to read this one paragraph because this was really shocking, and it makes you think about what is potentially happening today. In Latin America, Maxwell sold PROMIS to military dictatorships in Chile and Argentina. Their PROMIS was used to facilitate the mass murder that characterized Operation Condor, as the friends and families of dissidents and so-called subversives were easily identified using PROMIS. PROMIS was so effective for this purpose that just days after Maxwell sold the software to Guatemala, its US-backed dictatorship rounded up 20,000 subversives who were never heard from again. Of course, thanks to their backdoor, Israeli intelligence knew the identities of Guatemalans disappeared before the victims' own families.
Yeah, it's nuts. And it's a template for what has been set up in the United States now. And during the same period of time in the 1980s, you had the enterprise of Iran-Contra fame within the national U.S. security state use PROMIS to create a database called Main Core, which was a database of U.S. perceived dissidents. Because you could be on there, not necessarily because you're like, I want to overthrow the government, but because you went to a protest once, or you didn't pay your taxes on time, and all other sorts of reasons like that. And they plan to invoke it in the event of what they called a national emergency. But of course, that's a very vaguely defined term. And in their own documents, that national emergency could have been mass nonviolent mobilization against a U.S. invasion of another country.
Well, I want to come back to that, because isn't Main Core, that's essentially what Snowden was really frustrated about and eventually leaked, right? Or was that TIA?
He didn't talk about Main Core, but it's very related to what Snowden did talk about. So the illegal surveillance of Americans after September 11th, 2001, is sucking up all your data. And he's right about that. It is illegal. It is unconstitutional. But what he didn't say, and maybe he didn't know, is that all that information is you're profiled based on that today. Right. So if you are in the Main Core database because you've been naughty, then under your name is everything the NSA and affiliated agencies. Because remember, the US has 18 intelligence agencies today. It's all under your name, and it's a lot of stuff for every American.
I want to come back to that when we finish up with sort of the idea of data surveillance and where this is going. But to end on the PROMIS scandal, what was interesting is that also led to another mysterious death. That was a journalist, right? Danny Casolaro, who was reporting on...
It's more deaths than that. So John Tower, who I just mentioned, he dies in a very suspicious plane crash in early 1991. Robert Maxwell also dies in 1991. Danny Casolaro, the main journalist investigating PROMIS, dies in 1991 in what is staged as a suicide, but clearly not a suicide, as I point out pretty extensively in the book. And also one of Casolaro's main sources at the NSA, Alan Standorf, is found beat up and dead in the trunk of a car in 1991. So, and that's also, again, the same year William Barr is pardoning everyone involved in Iran-Contra. He commissions the BUA report, which is basically a whitewash of the whole PROMIS software scandal situation. And BCCI prevents investigations into BCCI. They're all really interrelated, as I point out in the book. Iran-Contra, PROMIS, and BCCI are really all part of the same scandal.
Well, William Barr keeps coming up. Can you just kind of share, because he's so relevant today, what should people know about him?
Well, basically, he's a CIA mop-up man. He's been there to clean up the mess for these operations when too much gets exposed. Because, the national security state, the CIA, these institutions mess up a lot, and a lot more than you think leaks through. But they have to control the media response, which by consolidation of media ownership has become over the years even easier than ever before for them to do. But you also have to control, really, it doesn't matter so much whether or not your operations are successful. You have to more than anything else control the cover-up, right? And so if you have to control the cover-up within the Justice Department or the FBI or those institutions, and then the mainstream media can come and just parrot whatever the FBI or Justice Department says, right? So that's essentially what William Barr's role has been. But I would argue it's even more than that when you look at things that happened during the Trump administration. What William Barr did during the Trump administration, which hardly anyone knows about, is that he legalized pre-crime arrests in the United States. You can be arrested for stuff you publish on social media, and they call it it's called, the acronym is DEEP. I forget exactly what it stands for. I think it's Disruption and Early Engagement Program. And by early engagement, it means they arrest you before you actually commit a crime. It's pre-crime. And there have been people in the US that have already been arrested because of this, but there are plans to make it, to expand it considerably. So around the same time that William Barr was created, DEEP, which I think was October 2019, you had Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, and Bob Wright, who was an NBC Universal executive very close to Donald Trump. We're all pitching Donald Trump, then president, of course, on creating HARPA, which is the health DARPA, and that the flagship program for HARPA would be Safe Homes, which is another acronym, and I can't remember what it stands for because it's quite long. But it essentially, what it aimed to do was use AI to data mine, social media posts by Americans, and then profile Americans based on early neuropsychiatric warning signs to stop mass shootings before they can happen. Because if you remember back to 2019, they were a spate of very odd mass shootings in that period, including the El Paso Walmart shooting, some garlic festival, a bunch of weird stuff happened in relatively short succession. And of course, a few weeks before that, William Barr was like, soon there will be an event that will galvanize Americans' opinion about why pre-crime is good. So that's interesting.
Well, I think it's important with what you just said to remind people that this really isn't, we divide ourselves into left and right and red versus blue. And maybe there's a lesser of two evils, but like this penetrates, this crosses all party lines. This is about sort of the people, the working class versus a smaller amount, arguably, right? I mean, there's more people than there are elites, yet they have all the control and power, right? And another name that comes up in your book that's relevant today is Larry Summers. I didn't realize that he was so involved with Epstein, flew on the Lolita Express. He was the former president of Harvard. He just stepped down from his advisory role, I believe, on DCG. If anyone is following the concerns around the crypto meltdown and what might be next with these crypto prime brokers, anything you want to share about Larry Summers? All right, it's time for another short break to hear these messages from my partners. First up, Fold. Fold is the best Bitcoin rewards debit card and shopping app in the world. You can earn Bitcoin on everything you purchase, from Amazon to groceries to sprucing up your wardrobe with Fold's Bitcoin cashback debit card. And you can win free Satoshis every day, or even play for the chance to win a whole Bitcoin by spinning the daily wheel and the purchase rewards wheel. I have an alarm set every day so I don't miss out on spinning the wheel and earning free sats. And it's also a great app to get someone that is totally new to Bitcoin. So if you want to join the fun, head to foldapp.com/Natalie and get 10,000 in free sats when you sign up. And finally, I'm excited to partner with CrowdHealth, a Bitcoin alternative to health insurance. Health insurance costs can be sky high today, and you essentially send money every month to a massive corporation, the health insurance black hole, as I call it. And if you don't need any health care, you never see that money again, right? But if you do need to go to a doctor, you end up having to pay even more out of pocket, especially if you end up as one of the 20% of claims on average that aren't covered. With CrowdHealth, you pay a small monthly fee that goes into an account that you actually accrue over time and is yours to use or keep if you ever leave. You can even save that money in Bitcoin. CrowdHealth is all about community, and the community crowdfunds everyone's healthcare. So if something does happen or you have a doctor visit, CrowdHealth will negotiate down the medical bill much lower than what insurance would be, and then the community helps you cover it. And in return, you help others cover their needs. For more information, you can head to joincrowdhealth.com/Natalie. And if you use promo code Natalie, you get 6 months for $99. All right, back to the show. Anything you want to share about Larry Summers?
Well, I guess there's a lot to say about Larry Summers, but a lot of it directly intersects with the stuff going on in the 90s with Epstein, Leslie Wexner, Harvard, and also this weird relationship Epstein seems to have with Treasury secretaries under Clinton. I didn't mention this earlier, but the first White House visit of Epstein. So in 1993, he made 3 visits. 2 of them were related to this fundraiser, I believe. But the first one, he was brought in by Robert Rubin, who was at the time director of the National Economic Council, but later becomes Secretary of the Treasury, and his deputy is Larry Summers. And then while deputy Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers goes on Epstein's plane. And then, of course, after that, when he's regular Treasury Secretary, there's a relationship there still. And then after that, he becomes president of Harvard, and that relationship becomes a lot more extensive. I talk about Epstein and Wexner's connection to Harvard a lot. And, Harvard is a real hive for elite craziness. Like Henry Kissinger, right, did a lot of stuff at Harvard. There he was, a mentor to Klaus Schwab, who a lot of people talk about these days. But among many other, he was a mentor to many other people like Klaus Schwab. He ran a CIA-funded seminar aimed at recruiting, global leaders to, penetrate the cabinets and whatnot.
Right. You talk about that too, with the WF, the YGL, right? The Young Global Leaders.
Yeah. And this has an intersection with Wexner's own stuff at Harvard and Wexner's broader philanthropy, which the Wexner Foundation, since it was created in the 80s, has been focused on creating young leaders, whether first off in the Israeli government and then Jewish American communities, and then from there sort of expands to, you know, young global leaders in general, and essentially teams up, and that the center he creates at Harvard in the early 2000s is very much affiliated with the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders program.
Well, I folded this page where you quote, it's Schwab stating the following about that program. I have to say, then I mentioned names like Mrs. Merkel, even Vladimir Putin, and so on. They have all been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. But what we're really proud of now with the young generation is Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina, and so on. We penetrate the cabinets. It is true in Argentina, and it is true in France now.
Yeah, and he's having that conversation with David Gergen. David Gergen is a longtime Washington insider and also a mainstream media journalist. You know, more like a hack. Anyway, he is the guy that Leslie Wexner essentially handpicked to be in charge of the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School, which Wexner funded into existence in the early 2000s. So a lot of people, especially mainstream media reporting, when they talk about Epstein's ties to Harvard and his access to the university with Larry Summers, they don't talk about how Wexner gave millions upon millions upon millions of dollars to the Harvard Center for Public Leadership at the same period of time, and act like the Epstein situation's isolated from Wexner, when in reality they're so intertwined with each other. You know, Epstein can do whatever he wants with any of Wexner's business entities. From like 1993 until like 2007, when he's already in trouble in Palm Beach for sex trafficking stuff. I mean, it's very nuts. So the idea that you would divorce them, you know, it doesn't make any sense.
Well, and he was obviously, you know, he had that close connection to Robert Maxwell, who was tied to intelligence, but you sort of allude to, was potentially Jeffrey Epstein a double agent?
I mean, he could have been, but we don't really know. I mean, there's obvious, it seems to me that the Israeli intelligence connection is really strong, and he claimed to have worked for the CIA at one point, but I would argue that was sort of before he was recruited into the Israeli intelligence fold. I would argue probably the early-ish 80s is more where that took place, because Epstein at one point claimed to have worked for the CIA and then later denies it, and then there's these other allegations about CIA stuff. But it's, you know, when he was in hot water with Palm Beach, he flies, you know, to Tel Aviv, and according to local Palm Beach reporters, he's touring military bases in Israel. So if you're just a financial advisor and you're accused of doing something naughty with a girl who was too young, and you're gonna go to Israel and tour military bases, does Israel let tourists tour military bases?
Right.
I don't think it really works that way. And you know, if you're trying to avoid jail and you are powerful and have powerful connections, you're going to go to the person you think is most likely to, like, you know, get you a get out of jail free card. Right. And so he goes there to military bases, and the allegation has always been it was an affiliation with Israeli military intelligence specifically, because the national security state in Israel is structured a little bit differently than the US. It's not, you know, the same system.
I just want to add a final note on Larry Summers, because for those that follow the financial stuff I talk about with Bitcoin, he also helped engineer the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which really helped fuel the next bubble and financialize, right? So I just wanted to touch on that. Okay, I know your time is limited. We've got like 25 minutes left. I really want to talk about sort of how we got to this place of more data surveillance. And I really found it interesting you discussing Palantir. More familiar names come up. Elon Musk in these chapters too, and LP Power and a potential Epstein tie there. So let's start to move into the more recent, I guess, decade with really them collecting all of this information. And so when we touched on PROMIS, and you mentioned main core, how much information is being collected? Like when I log into my commercial bank account, who can see what in the legacy financial system? And when I post something on social media, who has access to that? Like, what's being collected?
So like every website you go on has stuff like privacy policies and all of that, and no one reads it, right? And that's, you know, that or other documentation usually available on websites will tell you like what they're allowed to share. You know, on most websites you go on, they're like, oh, cookies, you know, will you accept cookies or reject cookies? And most people don't like think about any of this stuff, but basically you're having data sucked out of everything you do online. And it's, monitored, not necessarily by people. Today I think it's mostly AI doing all of it just because of the amount of it. And they also want to train AI on all these masses of data that are being produced every day. But it's very significant, and I don't think people really realize it. And I think the national security state decades ago realized how powerful this could be for them, and are content to have the public totally unaware of the significance of this stuff. And now we're moving into a paradigm where you have people like Eric Schmidt who are funded. Eric Schmidt is funding a bunch of top Biden officials, right? So he's not just some guy saying stuff and hoping people listen. Like, he's bought out a major sector of our government and is very involved with the national security state. He ran the National Security State Commission on Artificial Intelligence, which was basically the intelligence community, the military, and the top Silicon Valley companies, which, by the way, are almost all military or intelligence contractors at this point, chart out the path for AI. And Eric Schmidt just wrote a book with Henry Kissinger. He's been described as the New York Times as the next Kissinger. Lucky him. And basically, this book, among other things, argues that AI is essentially going to be the future of government. We're going to be governed by algorithms. And AI will, per them, be so superior, have such superior intelligence that it will never be able to justify its policy decisions. You'll just have to, computer says no, computer says yes. That's the future. But, if you, for example, read my book or a book like it, you will realize that this is the perfect cover for people like Schmidt and Kissinger to implement insane, awful policies that benefit them to the detriment of everyone else, and then say, oh, well, the AI said it and can't explain itself. And it's so much more intelligent than humans. We have to do whatever it says. And that's basically the trap that's being set for us, among other things. So going back to main core and HARPA and all of the stuff I mentioned earlier. So HARPA wasn't made under Trump. It was made under Biden. It exists. It's called ARPA-H. They just moved the H to the end. Same agency, same architects of that agency, same ex-DARPA people setting it up. And Biden claimed, oh, this is about curing cancer. No, the people that created HARPA, which are people from DARPA, essentially, specifically the biotechnology offices of DARPA, Jeffrey Ling being a main architect here, it was responsible for the HARPA pitch and safe homes and also the ARPA-H stuff. And it's, I think the lady that they put in charge of ARPA-H is from the CIA's equivalent of DARPA, IARPA, the intelligence ARPA. So yeah, that's not good. Anyway, main core, the database, the last time it was reported on by sort of a mainstream adjacent reporter was in 2008. And at that time, it was alleged to have 8 million Americans on it. It's probably more now. And so, like I mentioned earlier, this database has just like loads of data on everyone. So it's very hard to turn that into actionable intelligence, like to make sense of all this data and what it really means. That's where Palantir comes in. Palantir is the successor to the PROMIS software, 100%. And it was created, so basically, to understand Palantir, you have to understand something called total information awareness. So going back to main core,
after 9/11,
right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So after 9/11, you have DARPA running a planning to run a public-private partnership that they called Total Information Awareness. Go look up the logo. It's totally insane. And the logo is really all you need to see to know what's going on here. They decided to put in charge of this John Poindexter, one of the 5 Iran-Contra criminals that were pardoned by William Barr in 1991. And he's considered to be the godfather of modern surveillance.
Right.
TIA is, attacked by mainstream media, the ACLU, all of these organizations. It's going to destroy privacy in the United States, rip up the Constitution. It's awful. It's horrible. They tried to change the name to Terrorist Information Awareness because this was all about stopping terrorism before it starts. It was all about pre-crime and monitoring everything and everybody to stop terror attacks. That was the justification after 9/11. So that's why they changed the name to Terrorist Information Awareness, but it was never about that. Yeah. And what we're seeing now with this pre-crime stuff and HARPA and all of that is just the modern iteration of that and what they hope to enact in the future within the United States under the guise of what the Biden administration refers to as the war on domestic terrorism. Yeah. But anyway, going back to Palantir, total information awareness was so attacked and so negatively viewed that Congress defunded it.
Mhm.
So at the time that's going on, Peter Thiel, after having recently sold PayPal off to, I guess, eBay, Pierre Omidyar, Peter Thiel incorporates Palantir.
He's a big Bitcoiner, guys. Spoke at the last Bitcoin conference.
Yeah, well, I have very negative feelings about Peter Thiel, and it's all related to this stuff, really, in Palantir. Palantir, when it's being set up, Peter Thiel and Alex Karp are being helped in setting it up by a man named Richard Pearl. As I note in the book, Richard Pearl has undermined U.S. national security on numerous occasions. He's basically a spy for Israel, and he's also a neocon, an architect of the Iraq War, involved in lots of really horrible, nasty stuff over the years. And this is the guy that Karp and Thiel want to help them set up Palantir. Pearl facilitates their introduction to who else? John Poindexter, who was going to be running TIA, and they are basically looking to create a successor entity because they calculated, and correctly, that the outcry was because this was the military running this operation. They were like, what if a private company does it? Who will care? And yeah, they were pretty much right. So
is Bill Gates involved at all with this, with Microsoft?
With Palantir, as far as I know, the answer would be no there. But I think what you're thinking of is how the bridge sort of between PROMIS and Palantir is a company called Gilead, which was run by Ghislaine Maxwell's sister. And the Maxwell twins had a lot of ties with
Gates,
Microsoft.
Okay, for 2 minutes, can we really briefly touch on Twitter and Elon Musk? Because right now some of these conversations
really
are
quick,
coming up.
I think let me just finish the stuff about Palantir because it's important. So Palantir was funded into existence with Thiel's money, but also with money from In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital arm. For the first 3 years or so of their existence as a company, the CIA was their only client and guided the development of their product. Palantir programs went to CIA headquarters every 2 weeks to tweak and develop their product. The CIA, according to Alex Karp, was always the intended client of Palantir. And now it's a contractor to all 17 intelligence agencies. It can label Americans when you're in this paradigm where it's labeled, there's all these, you're profiled by the NSA and all of this. One of the labels it can attach to you is subversive. Sounds a lot like the passages you were reading about Latin America and PROMIS not too long ago.
Yeah, so, and I rewatched the Snowden movie recently where it showed that database. And once you get into one person's profile, everyone they're linked to, you have access to, and all of a sudden it's endless and it spreads like a virus. Well, a lot of people are also wondering about what the FBI or the CIA was doing with regards to censorship potentially on Twitter. So I wanted to get your take because it's really interesting what's happened with Twitter. It's obviously split like everything else in our country. Some people are making Elon into the hero that's going to save us and offer us all free speech. And then others are very, very skeptical about him. And he does, you mentioned him in the book, one of the suppliers to Tesla has ties to Epstein. And so there are some questionable things. What's your take on Elon Musk?
Okay, so really quick, first I want to say about Twitter. So what was revealed in the Twitter files about like the FBI and all of this collusion with censorship, that's not exclusive to Twitter. That happens at Google, that happens at Facebook, and a major theme of my work is that those entities, the national security state as an umbrella term here, have been involved with these companies since their inception in most cases of the big Silicon Valley companies. Yeah. So, to those that have been paying attention, it wasn't exactly news, but I'm glad it's being talked about because it obviously is not a good system. Now, Elon Musk.
Starlink, we've got, surveillance, Neuralink, all that.
Yeah, so Starlink is interesting because it's basically the revival of a company Bill Gates was trying to make in the late 90s called Teldesic that failed because a lot of the satellites and all of this were too expensive at that time, but are no longer that expensive. But it's essentially, the same vision of Starlink, all of that. very much involved with essentially the same as the Bill Gates effort several years prior. And of course, we know now that Starlink ends up in places like Ukraine. It was smuggled by someone into Iran. So that suggests that it's being used by intelligence agencies. If it's being smuggled into Iran, those intelligence agencies are probably the US and Israel. And then again, you have him through SpaceX being a major contractor to Space Force, the Pentagon. These are all very significant connections when it comes to Elon Musk. So, I would argue that in the American psyche, there is a deeply ingrained, I don't even know what to call it, like psychological habit, maybe, of looking for a personal savior. If we just vote this guy in for president, he's going to fix everything. I'm all in for Bernie. I'm all in for Trump. They're going to drain the swamp. They're going to end corruption, blah, blah, blah. As long as we get this one guy in at the top, it'll all be fine. Or as long as this one guy, we all back this one guy, he's going to fix everything. No, that is a pipe dream. And we've been conditioned to believe that, and I think, if you consider all of the money that, just think about how much money the CIA has pumped into crazy psychological experiments. So much money over the past 100 years or so has gone into investigating and developing ways to control how you think and manipulate how you behave and how you think and perceive things. It's very, and social media is a major battleground for that. I mean, you don't really know if a lot of the accounts that respond to you are real or not, or are authentic people, or they're bots. And now a lot of people are interacting with this Chat GPT, which is OpenAI, I believe, co-founded by Elon Musk. And a lot of people are like, oh, this is going to revolutionize this and that and change this, but it's going to manipulate how a lot of people think, because they're going to be interacting with this inorganic entity that's been trained on a very specific set of data and has very specific political views, which some people are talking about. And it's going to persuade people to believe things, or alter how people receive reality. And you had this situation a few months ago where there were claims that the Google Lambda, their, I guess, Chat GPT equivalent at Google, was sentient. And that turned out to be total bullcrap, because the guy later admitted that the transcript that was proof of sentience, he had heavily edited and wouldn't say how he had edited it. And, it's complicated, and we're not at a situation where there's actually organic artificial intelligence where it's creating stuff on its own. It's very good at imitating people because it's been trained on so many instances because of the internet and smartphones and all of that, of human speech. The internet's full of that stuff.
But we put so much information out there, and that's one of the things that scares me is, before, people were worried about kinetic war, violence in the physical sense, but you can invade a country with what China's doing with TikTok, right? Through certain algorithms to make us watch certain things, to make us dumber, to make us, focus our energy in certain places. And that's so much more dangerous when you can develop these sort of psychological and biological weapons that can really take down, nations, societies, communities. As we start
if you're Schmidt and Kissinger, you want the U.S. national security state to work with China to develop a system for control of the populace of the world that uses that technology, because they say to not do that, we'll have a catastrophic war with China that will kill everyone. So in order to avoid the catastrophic war with China, we basically have to become China. That's their argument, the Kissinger-Schmidt argument.
But I mentioned earlier, Whitney, we technically outnumber them, right? The people and the workers, the working class, they outnumber the elite. So do we have the power to make a change, or are you worried because so many people essentially seem brainwashed today? And they willingly give up their information because they feel a sense of convenience or security.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are willing to give it up because of convenience, but that's going to be the real test, because the only way this crazy corruption and this insane system leaves us the heck alone is when people stop buying into it and using it. The need for parallel systems is very obvious, I think, at this point. And those that choose not to invest in those in their own personal life are not going to be happy when shit hits the fan, which who knows when that could be, because economic stuff is very crazy and it's only getting crazier. And obviously, in looking at the CBDC rollout, it's very clear that there will be some event that necessitates mass adoption of CBDCs, because even in countries that have live CBDCs, Nigeria, China, no one's using it. So they have to have something happen to the existing currencies. And, you know, they've done a lot with inflation to like, you know, make them not favorable, but you know, they're going to have to go over things like crypto and Bitcoin and any sort of competitor to a CBDC to make it more attractive. The only way you can make a CBDC attractive is by eliminating all of its competition.
Well, maybe I'll have you back on just to focus on CBDCs and the FTX fallout and Bitcoin. I'm really curious because I know we're running out of time. So maybe we'll do a little speed round real quick because I really want to get some of these questions in. First of all, do you think Epstein could have children out there?
I have no idea, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, he was so obsessed with being like a modern day Genghis Khan in the sense that he wanted to like have a bazillion babies of his because he thought he was genetically superior. And like, I think it was Forbes or some other magazine like that was recently running a story about how certain elites in Europe and the US are trying to have like 9 or 12 kids so that they can like
Elon too. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And for a lot of the same reasoning. So like, you know, it came out with Epstein. Oh, even The Guardian, New York Times talked about how he's interested in eugenics, but a lot of the elite in general are interested in eugenics. And eugenics is not the same it was in World War II. Actually, the head of the British Eugenics Society, Julian Huxley, was appointed head of UNESCO not that long after World War II ended. And he said in his speech about the founding of UNESCO, it's time to make, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but about eugenics, we need to make the unthinkable thinkable again. And then 10 years later, he writes a book called New Bottles for New Wine and coins the term transhumanism, that this is the new eugenics, the merging of man with machine and being able to genetically edit people in vivo, like CRISPR allegedly can do now, and you know, the mRNA stuff and all of that. So you know, this type of ideology that we were, you know, rightly taught in school is wrong and evil and led to a lot of the atrocities of World War II, among other things. You know, it's still around. And it wasn't exclusive to Germany either. Actually, a lot of the German race science was either funded by the Rockefeller family or it was modeled after U.S. sterilization policies because eugenics was a big deal in the U.S. and Britain in the early 20th century in a very significant way. And a lot of those people are very much tied up with the academic medical establishment, particularly in Britain through the Galton Society, for example, have connections to the people that developed the AstraZeneca vaccine for COVID, among other things. I mean, there's a lot of really crazy ideology out there among powerful people. And, you know, it would be naive to think that they you know, aren't up to no good, you know,
that they'll give up their power. Well,
for people interested on that angle, I wrote an article a year or two ago about something called Welcome Leap, the Wellcome Trust, which I sort of describe. It's not necessarily accurate, but it's sort of like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for Medical Research in the UK, teamed up with an ex-director of DARPA who made DARPA equivalents for Google and Facebook named Regina Dugan, who actually greenlighted the US government's initial funding of mRNA vaccines in the early 2000s. And she's basically running this DARPA equivalent for the Wellcome Trust now called Welcome Leap that is basically trying to turn your kids into transhumanist zombies. It's totally insane and she's a ton of money behind her. Please go read about it. That's very bad.
Yeah. And we touched a little bit on transhumanism and eugenics in my last episode. So I hope people check it out. Just maybe a yes or no answer since we don't have time, but do you believe that the pandemic was a coordinated plan in order to initiate some of the ultimate economic or otherwise psychological control plans?
So I can't say with 100% certainty I know, but there's a lot of odd coincidences. So I'll give you one example because we've talked about this a couple times today. Eric Schmidt and the National Security and Artificial Intelligence. In 2019, they said that in order for the US to remain competitive in AI and maintain economic and military hegemony, which is all the US national security state and oligarchy care about at the end of the day, right? What had to happen is that the US had to go beyond to China in terms of tech adoption. This included eliminating what they referred to as legacy systems. This included the end of in-person doctor visits, telemedicine becoming the norm. It included the end of private cars, private car ownership, the end of delivery drivers, the end of cash, loads of stuff. And a lot of it, oddly enough, were pitched as solutions to COVID when COVID happened. And
Well, and they had
it's
mRNA essentially ready to go, even though it failed all these tests in humans, right?
right. So I wrote a 2-part series on Moderna that I would encourage people to read that are curious about what you noted or what you posited a second ago, whether this was coordinated. The behavior of Moderna before COVID is very bizarre and very alarming for multiple reasons. And we don't have time to really go into it today, unfortunately, but it is a very important story.
Yes.
And the head of Moderna is a very, very engaged in very suspect behavior with people at the NIH, and there hasn't been enough attention given to it, even by people with big platforms that are, prominent COVID skeptics, among other things. This is stuff that really needs to be seriously looked into when it comes to this company. And of course, Moderna has longstanding ties to DARPA,
Right.
who we've talked about a good bit, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, among other institutions. I definitely think people should consider some of the implications of what we're talking about here as it relates to COVID-19 policy, because it seems like there's efforts to bring some of these biosecurity policies back. But a lot of the policies that were enacted as a result of the panic around COVID-19 are very similar to policies that were pitched in the wake of the 2001 anthrax attacks, which I've written a lot about. And there's of course a lot of overlap by the people that eerily predicted the anthrax attacks through a national security exercise simulation called Dark Winter in June 2001. They were the same people that ran the much discussed Event 201 simulation of a novel coronavirus outbreak in 2019, which by the way was funded by Open Philanthropy, which is Dustin Moskovitz, a Facebook co-founder, who's and that was essentially created through the involvement of the founder of Effective Altruism, William
Right.
McCaskill, who is
Yeah.
essentially Sam Bankman-Fried's handler for
Yes.
most of his career. So,
Well,
fun
you
fact.
have thousands of names in these books. I just wanted to ask you, is there a hierarchy? Like, is there someone who you would say, or maybe two people who are maybe the most powerful or the most dangerous, and who would fill the void of like an Epstein?
Who would fill the void of an Epstein? Well, there's a lot of figures like Epstein throughout history. So we talked a little bit earlier about the Profumo affair, for example. The guy at the center of that was a dude named Stephen Ward. And he, like Epstein, was going to be on trial and just dies suspiciously in the middle of it. Right. And he was, pimping out all these girls, sexually blackmailing politicians enough to bring down an entire government.
And
So
you mentioned
there's
that
a lot of these guys.
Yeah, you mentioned that Epstein was sort of middle management, so there may be a lot of him, people like him. But so who's at the top? Like, could you pick one or two people who's the most powerful or the most dangerous person in the world?
I mean, that's really hard to know because I tend to look at connections and networks. So who's at the top of any one faction at any given time? It's really hard to know that unless you're working within it. And
so it's not like
don't.
a one most powerful person in the world. It's not a situation like that because there are so many
I don't
things
think
that
so. No, it's hard to know, but there are faces that we do see. I would argue that the most powerful people are people we don't see. A lot of the people that are in the public eye, that are saying this stuff and obviously working on behalf of these agendas, they're probably all somewhere near the middle or upper middle. The people really pulling the strings, I doubt we see their faces, or maybe in some cases even know their names, right? So in looking at stuff like Epstein's financial stuff with the foreign currency trading suspect stuff and Forexter and some of these like weird software programs, you have John Doyce come up a lot. And he's like this guy, nominally an oil executive, right? But he's also tied up with the creation of a private CIA by Ted Shackley, the blonde ghost of the CIA, and like has all these crazy connections. And most people don't even know who that guy is, but he was clearly like a big time player and a big part of Epstein's network. But going, you know, tied up with these guys going back decades, and no one's ever heard of them. So I figure there's a lot of people like that, you know, we don't really know. Right. So, you know, it's really hard to say who's on top. I mean, a lot of people like to argue that, but I think it's pretty clear, you know, that the people on top in the US right now are remnants of what was called the enterprise in the 1980s. I think they split off sort of into two, and that's, you know, sort of who's duking it out on the visible level of the US right now when there's power struggles.
Whitney, you are so incredible. There's like 50 questions I didn't get a chance to ask, so I have to have you back on. Thank you so much. I'm going to link your book. The question I just want to leave you with, really just because I'm so impressed by you and we're so grateful for the work that you do, and you put your life at risk. So my last question is just where do you get your bravery? Where does your bravery come from?
Well, thanks. I don't really see it as bravery. I see it as a necessity because, you know, I don't want to live in the system that's being created. And, you know, I have an ability, I guess, to put information together in a narrative, in a way with sourcing and all of that people can find compelling to help us figure out what type of situation we're actually in. Because until we have a full understanding of that, it's very hard to understand how to get out of it. You know, so, you know, I just don't really see any other alternative, you know, because they're taking everything from everyone, like everything that matters. So, like, why would you not do something to fight back?
I'm honored to talk to you and learn from you. Thank you so much. I hope everybody checks out your book. And will you come back on? Because next time we have to plan for 3 hours because I just can pick your brain forever. So Whitney, thank you so much. And I'll talk to you soon. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks. My pleasure.
Thank you so much for checking out this show. Again, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any new content. And I love to hear your feedback. Leave a comment or send me an email at natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. Let me know what you think, if you have guest suggestions, and I'll see you next time.